Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Jeremi Suri, the author of Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. He's written or edited a dozen books and is a professor of history at UT Austin. He also hosts a podcast called This is Democracy. Thanks so much for being here once again, Professor Suri.
My pleasure, Evan, and I love your show.
Thank you so much. Very nice of you to say. Before we start that show, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. There was a moment during the January 6th insurrection that it became clear the roots of it were grounded in the Civil War. That was when a Confederate flag was raised in the Capitol building, which had not happened even during the Civil War itself. The rebel nation had finally risen. In Civil War by Other Means, Dr. Suri argues that fighting was only one technique that Southern rulers used to exert its view of America on the rest of the population. So, Dr. Suri, how did the South find enough weak spots in democracy to re-engage white supremacy even after they'd lost the Civil War, a war that Lincoln said was being fought specifically so that government of the people would not perish?
It's a great question, Evan. I think it's the most important question. And really what that question comes down to are the sources of continued resistance from those who had lost the war. And they have three modes of resistance that continue from the 1870s, that are nurtured in the 1880s and 90s, and that we see today. And by the way, these are all modes of resistance at the time conducted mainly by Democrats. So although what I'm saying might sound like it's critical of one particular group today, this is not a partisan history at all, because in fact, the Republicans are the ones who are pushing for more inclusion and equality after the Civil War. It's the Democrats who are not. So the first form of resistance is the most obvious, but the one we pay least attention to. It's noncompliance, actually refusing to surrender, refusing to admit that you've lost. And that there's a long tradition of that in the United States, actually. It's not something new. So elections that were lost when new African-American voters vote in states like Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, and Florida. And in the 1860s, African-Americans are elected to office. In fact, more are elected to office, Evan, in 1868 than will be again until 1968. Many local white communities refuse to accept these elections, claim they're fraudulent. That's the word they use. And many keep their arms and don't give up. I profile in the book a whole number of exiles, people who left the South, went to Mexico, took their slaves with them, and continued to resist, then came back and were reelected to office. That's the second way that resistance occurs. It's not just non-compliance. It is actually a non-application of the law and twisting the law. Local law enforcement often sided with white supremacists. Local law enforcement often encouraged violence. And then that's the third point. We have noncompliance, we have the misuse of the law, and then we have actual political violence. And this is a really important point. We are a very violent society. We've long been a very violent society. And although we talk about shootings and things as if they're acts of mental issues for the shooter, in reality, most of the violence in our society has political purposes behind it. Those who act are acting for a political purpose. And what we see throughout the country in the 1880s and 90s is in particular the use of violence to attack communities, to attack those who support African-American and immigrant communities and others. The Ku Klux Klan is just one of many examples of this that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, and I do want to ask you about the founding of the KKK, but before we get to that, let's pretend that there could be a Lord democracy, a textbook democracy, right? Small d, democracy. If we could paint a picture, if that Lord could say, this is what democracy will look like after the Civil War, what would that have looked like, and how was that plan going?
So, if there were to be something closer to Lincoln's vision of government of the people, by the people, for the people, which, as you cited, Evan, is the textbook Lord definition of democracy, you would have had two things that we didn't have. You would have had protection for voters, for everyone to vote who was a citizen, which has never occurred in our society. We are the greatest democracy in the world with the worst voter protections. And as I show in the book, that's intentional after the Civil War because of the 4 million former slaves who become citizens. Many local communities don't want them to vote because that would change the makeup of the government in those local communities. This includes the North as well as the South. So if we had this Lord democracy, we would have the strictest protections for voting as we have for speech. We'd have an amendment that didn't just say you could not deny voting based on race, but actually protected everyone's right to vote in the way the First Amendment protects all of our right to free speech. And the second thing we'd have is we would have strict and equal law enforcement against all uses of violence or threats of violence and bullying in our politics. Our politics have long been filled with that, and that has been allowed to fester in our system.
And in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, how was that going?
So the problem was that most of the losers, most of the Confederates, went home with their weapons and continued to organize in their local communities. So, quite frankly, their weapons should have been taken away, and land should have been redistributed. I mean, the problem you had was the 4 million slaves who became full citizens, and then the millions of immigrants. We're talking about Jews as well as African Americans here. Jews were considered black in the 1870s and 80s, as were Irish. All of these quote-unquote black citizens, even if they were now nominally, thanks to the 14th Amendment, if you're born in the country, now you're a citizen, they have a right to citizenship. They don't have a means of supporting themselves, and they don't have a means of protecting themselves. And that should have been dealt with by land redistribution, and it should have been dealt with by removing weapons from the former Confederates.
You argue that the battle for America is captured by the collision of Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. And it makes me certainly emotional to talk about it because it's hard to think of Lincoln as a martyr, but indeed it is quite clear that's what he was. There's a wonderful book that I just pulled off the shelf called America's Original Sin, White Supremacy, John Wilkes Booth, and the Lincoln Assassination. It's by John Rodehimmel, and it makes very clear that John Wilkes Booth was a white supremacist, that many to this day don't realize how deep those beliefs ran in his veins, and that he quite literally stalked Lincoln in an effort to take him out for those reasons. What do we need to know about John Wilkes Booth's vision for America at the moment he pulled the trigger?
It's a great question, Evan. And it's not something that's taught in New York City public schools where I learned history. And it's certainly not taught in Texas public schools. John Wilkes Booth was not a lone actor. That's the point you're making. He was part of a large network of white supremacists who were very concerned, and we can understand why they were concerned. We don't have to sympathize, but we can still empathize. These were people who saw their lives being turned upside down. Imagine if you grew up and you became an elite performer in a society of gentlemen and gentle ladies, where the presumption was that the white performers were superior and the African Americans who did all the stage work and things of that they were, in essence, animals. And all of a sudden now they are going to be in power. Booth and so many others were struck. They were horrified by seeing African Americans who had been slaves months before now carrying muskets for the Union Army. 100,000 served in the Union Army. And Booth witnessed African American soldiers in Union Army uniforms holding white Confederates prisoner in Washington, D.C. Yeah. And so he was part of this broad network. And what my research dug up that I didn't know, certainly, was how revered Booth was in the South. I spent a lot of time looking at old newspapers. I love looking at old newspapers as a historian. And Booth was treated as a hero, slaying the tyrannous Caesar of Lincoln. And he knew that. That was what he appealed to. He believed that people in the South would rise up to defend him. And in a way they did. And that's the point.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Perhaps the most emotional scene of the whole book. Maybe I just get emotional about Lincoln, but his funeral. And I never heard it described this way. As you say, it may have been the largest multiracial gathering in American history. How symbolic was that? And also, how did Lincoln's multiracial funeral foreshadow the fight that was to come?
I think Lincoln's funeral train, as it slowly rolls from Washington, D.C., up through New York, along through the Midwest, eventually making its way to Springfield, it becomes almost a religious event for so many Americans. Lincoln is seen as the figure who is opening America, parting the seas, bringing together populations that were not together before, and articulating a new country. And you have African Americans, Jews, Catholics, all these groups, as well as elite white figures in New York City and elsewhere, who come to see the train, pay homage to Lincoln, and it shows the potential for multiracial democracy. Just as I say in the book, because all these groups are actually gathering, it's not segregated. People walk solemnly to see the open casket of the body that's brought into cities like New York. And we have testimony from so many people whose lives were changed by that moment. Maybe as many of my students' lives were changed by watching the video of George Floyd being lynched. Theodore Roosevelt is just the one I'd like to point to. He's a young boy, and he and his brother, Elliot, are watching from their fancy New York apartment.
And there is a picture of that moment, maybe one of the most amazing pictures in American history.
Isn't it extraordinary?
Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
And they're watching. You can see the pictures in my book. You can see these two little boys looking from the window. Theodore Roosevelt says that moment changed him because he recognized the potential for a multiracial democracy. And Theodore Roosevelt is the heir to Abraham Lincoln in this way. His career, his possibility starts at that moment. This just occurred to me, but we know that Frederick Douglass had met Lincoln just a couple of weeks before at the reception for the second inaugural. Do we know whether Frederick Douglass was at any of the official funeral proceedings, or if not, what was he doing during those days? So I believe Douglass was, and I believe he actually spoke very eloquently about Lincoln as a prophet for new democracy. Douglass saw the flaws in Lincoln. He saw Lincoln as sometimes politically manipulable or manipulating, I guess is the right way to put it. But Douglass revered Lincoln as a man who pointed to a new future. You can really see Douglass and Walt Whitman as, in a sense, the two figures who capture this moment in their words. And Douglass will, as you know, Evan, refer to Lincoln the rest of his career. He will be a lifelong Republican, Frederick Douglass will, trying to carry forth Lincoln's vision.
So what starts to happen in the North? You've gotten into what was happening in the South at the beginning of the post-Civil War period. What starts to happen in the North? Can you describe what Union leagues were and what they teach about the tradition of organizing to protect rights?
Absolutely. So all kinds of groups are formed in the North. Many of them go back to the pre-Civil War era, but they multiply after the Civil War. There are Union leagues, Liberty leagues, other groups, many of which include African Americans. Frederick Douglass himself is very instrumental in encouraging these groups to form. He goes on lecture tours. And these are organizations of African Americans, free African Americans, and white citizens, white Republicans, who form to protect African American rights, to provide aid to the South, and to in the terms we would use today, to lobby for civil rights laws. And in 1866, as I describe in the book, Congress passes really far-reaching civil rights legislation, responding to many of these groups. And that legislation becomes the basis for the 14th Amendment.
And how successful was the implementation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments?
Not very successful, because we have a new president after Lincoln's assassination, thanks to John Wilkes Booth, who is dead set against enforcement. Andrew Johnson, who is on the ticket in 1864, because he's the only Southern senator who did not secede. Andrew Johnson was, like Andrew Jackson, his hero from Tennessee, pro-slavery but also pro-union, and pro-union came first. So Johnson stays in the Senate. He's put on the ticket by Lincoln in 1864 because Lincoln wants to run as a national unity candidate.
And just to cut you off for a second, should Lincoln have done that at the time?
No.
He should not have done that. He could have won either way.
We don't know. I mean, most historians, myself included, would say Lincoln wins because of Grant's successes on the battlefield in the months leading up to the November election. Let me also just insert here, Evan, that mail-in voting, which I know is controversial today, begins then. And mail-in voting then, as it is today, is primarily to allow those in the military and those who have to travel for work, for whatever reason, to serve their country, to be able to vote. In 1864, most of the Union soldiers, most of them, vote by mail.
Did anyone call it a fraud?
No. Well, yes, some of the Southern Confederates did, but there's no evidence it was fraudulent in the least. Soldiers voted, and in fact, those were some of the most supervised elections because they were supervised to vote one time and only one time by mail ballot. And some of them voted against Lincoln, by the way. He didn't just win all the soldiers. So the problem with putting Johnson on the ballot, why it was a bad idea, in retrospect, of course, we know what Lincoln didn't know, was Johnson was fully unprepared to be president and was committed to reversing much of the civil rights advances that the Republican Party was pushing for. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, particularly the 14th and 15th, are largely non-enforced by the federal government. It takes the Congress to go around the executive to force the federal government to actually enforce these amendments.
What did the Union Army expect of Black fighters after the war was over in terms of the role they would play in society?
Such a great question. This is one of the most transformative parts of the Civil War, and there's so much scholarship on this. This part of my book builds on the work of many other historians the last 10 to 15 years. The Civil War is like World War II in this way. So many groups that were seen as inferior by mainstream Americans prove they're not inferior, and they gain a claim to citizenship. I wrote a book about Henry Kissinger years ago. He became an American in the U.S. Army in World War II. He and so many other Jews were seen as American for the first time because they put on a Army uniform and were defending their country. The same is true for more than 100,000 African-American men who had been slaves just days and months before. Ulysses Grant comments on this. He goes into the war, Grant does, as a white supremacist and as a anti-Semite. First thing he does in many places he goes is remove Jews from office, Grant does. By the end of the war, he comes to see African-American soldiers and Jewish soldiers as equal in courage to the white soldiers. And he has a transformation, and it is transformative for Grant and for so many Americans, and for these Jews and African Americans and others who served in the Union Army. Now, Evan, just like their successors after World War II, they have a claim to citizenship that they didn't have before. The African Americans who are in the U.S. Army also learn to read and write, as most of them didn't before, and they become wage earners. And I show in the book some photos of some of these families. They're becoming embourgeoised. They now have resources to live what we call capitalist lives, and they do it very well.
How did the South react to Johnson and the moves that he starts to make to swing things back in their direction?
There's a great deal of support for what Johnson is doing in many Southern white communities because he's seen as protecting white privilege. It's as simple as that. These are white communities. I talk about Ben Tillman in the book. He's one example in South Carolina. These are white communities where there are now a majority of former slaves who are now African-American potential voters. And they're concerned, these white communities, that the former slaves and the Jews and the immigrants are going to vote them out. and do things they don't want. And they see Johnson, these white communities do, as a protector. And that's how Johnson talks about himself. He was from East Tennessee. He was a white tailor. He didn't like the rich people who owned the plantations, but he really didn't like other groups that would challenge poor white people and their status. And this is really important. Those who were not doing well in white communities, they felt most challenged by new citizens who were African American and had other backgrounds.
I don't know if there's a statue or a memorial to Abram Colby, but there should be.
Yep.
Introduce us to Abram Colby, and how does he encapsulate the new successes? And then I guess thus the fears that had developed among white Southerners.
Yeah. So Abram Colby is a former African American soldier who becomes a key actor in various African American communities in the South in trying to help with land ownership, building businesses, educational connections, and he's part of a large group of former soldiers who leave the Union Army and become community leaders for African Americans in one way or another. And he becomes a target for those who feel threatened by him from white communities of different kinds. And so it is the advances of certain actors, certain former slaves, now former Union officers, veterans, and it is the attack upon them by white communities. And the violence, Abram Colby is one of a number of African Americans directly attacked and eventually lynched by communities of white law enforcement and white business owners and others who feel threatened by him.
Do you know if there's a memorial to him, by the way? I'd be curious.
I don't think there is. I think there are accounts of his life. There might be a plaque somewhere, but there are many more memorials to the attackers than there are to the victims.
There's a marvelous scholar who I know just a little bit, not very well, but a little bit. We've exchanged a few emails. His name is Douglas Edgerton, and he's written books on violence in the South perpetrated by whites against blacks. And he describes the beginnings of the Ku Klux Klan. So if you can, just explain how the KKK starts to operate and how they tapped into this feeling that this war is still going on.
Sure. So the KKK is the most infamous of groups of Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee, is where they start. And they organize to protect, in their words, their communities. And they're going to protect their communities not simply by trying to undermine Black and Jewish and Catholic businesses and Black and Jewish and Catholic schools, but by using political violence and intimidation. And what they will do is anonymously as a group, though they know who they are, one and another, they will make an example of those who cross what they think are the lines that should limit mobility for groups that challenge them. They also build networks and communities among themselves. So they're also a business organization in a sense. They're helping white business owners, white law enforcement, and others work together. And then they enfranchise themselves, right? They create different groups in different states. And by 1869, they're a major source of violence and intimidation throughout, not just the South, but also many parts of the Midwest, Indiana, Wisconsin, and elsewhere. And of course, they continue to exist today.
Today, it's not uncommon to drive around in the North. Look, I went to school in Ithaca, which is somewhere left of socialism, socialist. But in the areas around Ithaca, and in many areas of Pennsylvania and Ohio, you will see Confederate flags. Ithaca was not part of the Confederacy, and upstate New York was not either, and neither was Pennsylvania, and neither was Ohio. So clearly there was a feeling of kinship there that still exists today among like-minded people, the geography, notwithstanding. How did Democrats in the North in the 1870s react to this ongoing Civil War? And that's large D Democrats.
Yeah. So the Democratic Party tries to sanitize its history by claiming that it accepts now in the North the end of slavery, but also claiming that it has to protect white citizens. And this is a common phenomenon we see, that after a major transformation, those who are in a position of having to make concessions, perhaps, or give up some of the power they have, they will treat themselves as victims. So the Democratic Party of the North remarkets itself as anti-slavery, but pro-white supremacy. And that's what the Confederate flag becomes. Let me be clear about where I stand on this as a historian and someone who's also Jewish. I don't see that much difference between a Confederate flag and a Nazi swastika. I'm very uncomfortable as a Jew if I go somewhere and someone has a swastika, right? And we wouldn't allow swastikas on a college campus or somewhere like that. Why? Because it valorizes and brings us back to somehow justifying Nazi ideology. Well, the Confederate flag is a flag of white supremacy. It's now separated from slavery, in the words of the Democratic Party in the North, but it's used to symbolize that I, as a politician, or our community outside Ithaca, we care about white people, as if somehow white people are victims. And let me also be clear on this. There are many white people who suffer in the South as well as in the North, but there's no doubt that white supremacy is built around the exclusion of other people from possibility. And that's what the Confederate flag is about in the 1870s and 80s, and that's what it's about today.
Two things start happening in the North and then among the U.S. government. One is that the government heroically, under Ulysses Grant, goes through the South and does its best to root out large swaths of the Klan. On the other hand, there is fatigue in the North of keeping up this federal support for Black interests. So describe that dichotomy and how important that divergence eventually becomes.
So this is a key point, I think, in understanding our history. Ulysses Grant really tries to enforce the law, as Andrew Johnson did not. Some of that is Grant's own experience, as we talked about earlier, Evan, right? His coming to see that these communities deserve protection. But also, Grant believes the law should be enforced. That's how he defines himself. And he pushes through Congress the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act, which incidentally is still the piece of legislation used to prosecute the people who led an insurrection and broke into the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021. It's the same legislation that's being used. He uses the Union Army, as you say, to put down the Klan, to break up the Klan in the South, because local law enforcement is actually part of the Klan in most cases. The problem is that Northerners, Democrats and Republicans, become more and more uncomfortable with this for two reasons. One, they just want to move on to other opportunities. They have other priorities. There's a lot of money to be made in the West. And so there's a concern as to why we're giving attention. And then secondly, there's also a sense we've won the war. We've done all we need to do. And you see many Northerners saying, you can't fix the South anyway, so just let them go on their own way. It's sort of like that group that continues to resist and in a sense wears down the stronger group, because the stronger group just gets tired, as you say, fatigued, Evan, from this. And this undermines Grant, undermines Grant's efforts. He creates the Justice Department, Ulysses Grant did, to enforce civil rights law, and then his own Northern Republicans defund, that's the word they use, defund his Justice Department.
How important is the Colfax riot? I was reading about it in your book, and I'm not sure if we're a little bit out of order. I think it was right around the end of Grant's term.
1873. No, you're right on. You're right on target. It's his second term.
How important is it that we understand this sort of marriage of violence and politics, and how that then sets not only us on the path towards having Confederate memorials, but also towards the beginnings of segregation in the South?
Yes, the Colfax coup is really what I would call it, is absolutely crucial. This is 1873. It's the town of Colfax in Louisiana, not too far from Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And this is a town with a large African-American community, former slaves, who have elected their own leadership. It's an African-American town with African-American leadership, and a organized group of white citizens led by local law enforcement and local judges. They stage a coup and assassinate the leadership of this local government because they find it threatening to their authority. Evan, people have often asked me, about the first coup attempt in American history on January 6, 2021. I say it's not the first. That's the first one that occurred at the federal level. You have multiple coups occurring. Wilmington, North Carolina is a story similar to Colfax just 15, 20 years later, where local groups of organized, violent white actors will literally assassinate elected black officials and take control and establish a rule that you cannot have African-American leadership. And this is really a moment when what we come to call Jim Crow is really put into place, because it's not simply that white communities in some cases are resisting the law. They're now using political violence in a directed way, and there's a direct message to African-Americans, to Jews and others, that you don't cross a line. And of course, for the next 100 years, when someone crosses the line, this violence will be used, it will be targeted, and it will be effective. I remind people that as late as 1964, 3 civil rights workers, right, in Mississippi were murdered, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, and no one was prosecuted. No one was prosecuted. The coup in Colfax is the beginning of that story that will last really until the mid-1960s in our country.
You wrote a book, Dr. Suri, that the presidency is extraordinarily difficult for one person to do. And you argued that particularly after World War II and the government got bigger and more complex and more jobs were assigned to the president to do. And that the job is basically just too big for one person to have. I'm wondering, though, if maybe you could have written the book about an earlier time period, because it seems like in these 1870s and 80s, it was a very difficult job for one person to do. So how do you take your argument about the 20th century and put it into the 19th century and evaluate how challenging this job was for one person to do, given all the forces that were at play?
It's a great question, Evan, and we underrate how difficult this job has always been, and certainly was in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. But I will also say that I think one of the differences in that period was that even though the job was difficult, you did not have the wide number of agencies to manage, and you did not have the number of international crises to deal with. There were international crises, but presidents didn't have to care about what was happening in the Middle East in the same way and things of that sort. The challenge that the presidents have, in my book, that Grant and Hayes and Garfield have, and many other forgettable presidents, is that they lacked the institutions. They had too few federal mechanisms for enforcing the law, whereas the problem after Roosevelt is there are too many institutions, and the institutions are running against each other. So I think it's a different kind of problem, but your fundamental point is right, that it takes an extraordinary person, it takes a Lincoln or a TR, to be a successful president. And certainly from Lincoln's death to TR's presidency, for those 35 years, we don't have those kinds of, we have good people, but we don't have people with those political and leadership skills.
Whenever I get to the Hayes-Tilden election, I start to cringe in any book, because I really see this as a turning point, and this really is where things go off the rails in the South, and we start to have segregation in the South. How close did Hayes and Tilden and that election get to starting a second civil war? And reading your book, I was like, wow, I never realized how close the violence actually came. This is in 1876. What can we learn from the deal that was made to avoid civil war?
So the 1876 election should remind us that problems with our elections are not new. In fact, they were standard in the late 19th century. And in the 1876 election, we still really don't know who won. We know that Samuel Tilden, governor of New York, who ran as the Democratic candidate, had more total votes. But the key question is 3 states, Louisiana, South Carolina, and of course Florida. These elections always come down to
Always,
Florida.
yeah. We require, that's required by the way. Yeah.
And in those states, it's so close. It's hard to know who won the state, and whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes. And in each of those three states, you have a Republican governor who has interestingly just lost election, but still is the person to certify the election. And each of them certifies for Hayes. And so Hayes wins, it appears, by one electoral vote. Democrats don't accept that. And from November until late February, because the inauguration is then in March, there's no agreement, and there's no certification from Congress. The Senate, which is under Republican control, certifies for the Republican. The Democratic House refuses, and this is a real problem. And we get very close to actual fighting over these issues. There is a lot of low-scale violence. Some states in the South begin to mobilize their militias. There's concern, and Ulysses Grant has to actually begin to think through, I talk about this in the book, using federal force to enforce the election when he's leaving office. But of course, he'd be enforcing it for a Republican successor, for someone from his own party. Mm-hmm. At the last minute, a deal is made. And the deal is made really by some former Whigs who are now Democrats who have connections to the Republican Party. And the deal is twofold, that Hayes will become president, but in return, first, he will take the Union forces, the remaining military force, out of the South, allow the South to enforce or not enforce the law. And second, he will provide large grants of money to the South from the federal government, particularly for agricultural and infrastructure supports. And this will be the beginning of a long trend in our history where federal money is used not to help the needy, but to help the politically demanding in certain parts of the country. And I'm sure your listeners have all noticed this. From that point forward, the states that receive the most federal money are also usually the states that are most anti-federal government. And the federal government is, in essence, trying to buy them off in one way or another. This begins with the sub-treasury, which is agricultural support for the South, as well as infrastructure. So those who are Democrats who claim they're anti-federal, they're really not anti-federal. They just want the federal money for themselves, and that's part of this deal.
I don't remember if this is an exact quote from the book, but I wrote it down. I'm pretty sure it is. What you say is, in this election, compromise didn't bring goodwill. It liberated the violence.
Yes. It empowered those who had been acting in violent ways to resist federal power. It gave them more power. The election didn't resolve things because it actually protected them. It said the federal government would not enforce the law, and it said the federal government would, in fact, fund them. So it gave more support to bad behavior. I talk about Ben Tillman, for example, in the book, who's an arch white supremacist supporter of violence by the Red Shirts, who are a group like the Ku Klux Klan. Ben Tillman treats this as a victory for him, and he'll become the most important voice in South Carolina for a long time as senator and governor, arguing for continued resistance and violence toward immigrant and African-American communities and continued resistance to the federal government. And in return for that, he'll say, look at all the goodies we get in response.
How should we view James Garfield through this whole fight? He was only president for a brief time. He seems like a good man. He had pretty forward-thinking ideas on public education. But you end the book with Garfield, and most books don't end with Garfield. Most books don't mention Garfield.
Right.
So how should we view Garfield's, let's say, his insistence on the need for public education during this difficult time? And how should that resonate in today's society where public education is at the forefront of our political battles?
Great question, Evan. So James Garfield is from Ohio. The way to become president in the late 19th century was to be from Ohio. Yeah. And like Hayes, his predecessor, and to some extent like Grant, who's from Illinois and Ohio, he's a Union veteran, highly respected figure. He's also self-made. He's the child of he's an orphaned child. He really kind of raises his mother himself. He does all sorts of things that make him an incredibly respectable person. And he comes into office in the 1880 election after a very close election. Again, all these elections are very close from 1876 till 1900. And his goal is to try to move beyond this impasse that was created by the 1876 election. And he wants to move beyond this impasse, not by forcing change on the South, but just as you said, Evan, by using the power of the office of the presidency to encourage education, to encourage enlightenment, to encourage a new generation of Southerners and Northerners to see a common mission in a multiracial democracy. And he really invests his ideas and thinking in this. He never gets started because after his first weeks in office trying to fill patronage positions, he's shot by Charles Guiteau, who's an angry office seeker who's not given the office he wants, not given any office. And then he dies because of medical malpractice, the president does. After he's shot, a number of doctors stick their uncleaned hands into his wound and infect him, and he dies from a long-term infection that was poorly treated by his doctors. Garfield represents to me the last moment when there was a serious person in the presidency who believed they could fix this rupture. The presidents who come after him, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, they're largely forgotten because they largely avoid this issue. They accept North-South divisions. They accept that there will be two conceptions of democracy. This is my point in the book, that there's not a resolution to this debate. And they avoid the issue. They avoid doing much of anything, especially around this issue. And so it's the end of efforts to really change this until we get to Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson almost a century later.
Let's give Garfield some of his due here. I have a quote that I keep in a little bank of quotes that I come across in books. I'm pretty sparing in adding to it, so it's exclusive terrain here. The quote that I love from Garfield is, "Next in importance to freedom and justice is popular education, without which neither freedom nor justice can be permanently maintained."
Yep, and this reflects his life. He was a self-made man through education. And he believed that should be available to everyone, and he believed that public education would provide a basis for people to learn to live together and accept one another. And I think he's right about that. Today, too many people are trying to use education as they have in the past, not to broaden the minds of people, but to keep people focused only on a few issues that they care about. And that's the tragedy of our debate today. It's not about enlightenment. It's about how do I get my way shoved into the education system?
How long could this book have been if you kept up this examination, not through Garfield, but through, let's say today?
Well, it could have been much longer, and because I think there are lines of continuity. The book goes from Lincoln's assassination to Garfield's intentionally. First of all, I think there are dramatic bookends there. These are the first two presidents assassinated. Two men of enormous potential. Of course, we see more of that in Lincoln than in Garfield, because Garfield wasn't president very long, but they're two men of extraordinary potential. And I think these are the moments when things were plastic, when it could have been very different. After Garfield's presidency, it takes enormous effort to change this. Think of what's happened by 1881. The Confederates have lost the war, but they've actually imprinted the new institutions in the South. The Civil War is the second American Revolution, as James McPherson told us decades ago. He's right. It's as important as the American Revolution in changing American institutions, reforming American democracy. And Southerners are able to plant within the institutions of this new democracy cancerous tumors of white supremacy that are very, very hard to get out. And we're still struggling with that.
And just describe some of the ways that Jim Crow takes hold in the South, not just in segregation, but in voting rights and in things that are really not cured until the 1960s, 50s,
right.
and 60s.
Correct. And I try to talk about this at the end of the book. So voting, which we referred to already, is the most extreme, obvious, and important of these examples. We have very few federal protections for voting. So the 15th Amendment says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race. 19th Amendment, 1920 will say you can't based on sex, but they leaves a whole space open for other ways of denying people the right to vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, onerous registration requirements. Your state in Florida preventing felons from voting. People who were arrested as drug dealers serve a few years in prison, but yet they can never vote again. but yet the real estate moguls who owe billions of dollars, they still get to vote. All sorts of ways of shaping and discouraging voting from different groups. That's intentional. What I try to show in the book is that's intentionally planted in our institutions in these 20 years that I cover in the book. Gerrymandering, too. Gerrymandering is an old story, but it is this moment that the science of using gerrymandering to make sure that certain groups are completely excluded becomes normal in the political discourse, not just in the South, but in the North. I grew up in New York City. This was done in New York as well. And that becomes central to our politics. And then I just think the acceptance of white supremacy and the violence around it, it's so strange to me, Evan, that to this day, when violence occurs in our society, what just happened in Colorado Springs, we say, so this person had a mental problem, obviously. Well, of course they did, but look at who's targeted repeatedly. Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, right? And look who does the violence. Look who's responsible for the violence. And we come to accept it, or let me put it another way, our institutions seem incapable of reacting to it. That's intentional, I show, in this period after the Civil War. It's built into, it's not a bug, it's built into the software.
So when you go to college, there are 2 100-level courses in probably almost every school, but at least I'll use my school as an example. One 100-level course on U.S. history is U.S. history to 1865, and then the next course is U.S. history since 1865. And there is a separation there. And you go to college thinking, okay, well, now I know how things worked before the Civil War, and now I know how things worked after the Civil War, as if these are 2 different countries. How do we reform that idea that we can look at America in 2 big, giant time periods and pretend one has nothing to do with the other?
Great question. I teach that latter course at the University of Texas.
Is that what it's called there since 1865?
Yes,
yeah.
I teach U.S. history since 1865. I love teaching it. I have 300 undergraduates when I teach that course, and I love it because most of them are not history majors. Many are really bright engineering and business students, and it's my chance to give them a little history. For them not just know the history and learn the history, but to also learn how historians approach issues. It makes sense to break the history at 1865 because the Civil War is the Second American Revolution, as I said. But the first thing we have to teach students is that history is about layers. It's like archaeology. It's not about stops and starts. And so those lower layers, the older layers, are still there, and they deeply affect us. This is why everyone needs to study slavery, and it's the most patriotic subject to study, because you cannot understand our society if you don't understand that initial layer that includes slavery in it. It affects everything in our society, and it's patriotic to study that because it's by understanding that you can study both the limitations but also the accomplishments we've made. We should be proud that we eliminate slavery, but we should also deal with the legacies of that.
What do you say to the political rhetoric today that says we're making people just feel bad about their country? We're making Americans feel sad that this has all happened, and you're teaching the negative view of history, and America is a great place, and look how happy my family is here, and look at all the things our country has achieved. Why are you shoving all this negativity down our throat?
I lost you again there at the end. I lost you at the end.
The question is, why are you shoving all this negativity down our throat? What do you say to people who are just tired of hearing how difficult and how racist certain things were in society?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Let me begin by saying I'm the child of immigrants. My father's an immigrant from India. My mother is the child herself of immigrants from Russia who fled pogroms in Russia. My father came to the United States in 1965, fleeing famine in India. I will stand second to no one in my love of this country. I'm not supposed to say that as a historian, but look, I love this country. I couldn't get to do what I do if it weren't for this country. And as I say at the end of the book, this is really the reason I wrote the book, what I closed the book on. I believe that patriotism in the United States means you believe in what your country is about. I believe in the aspirations of our country. I believe in the Declaration of Independence. I believe in the Gettysburg Address that you cited so well before, Evan. And what does that mean? It means I want to hold my country to those standards. Same way I parent. I love my children. I support my children. And when we sit down at dinner, we talk about how they can be better. And they talk about how I can be better. And they have a long list about how I can be better. Parenting is not telling your kid they're always great and then letting them come home and eat chocolate cake and watch TV all day. Those are the worst parents.
That's what I do all day.
So what I'm doing is patriotism, I think, because I'm saying I believe in our country. I believe we can be and have been better. And we need to hold ourselves to the highest standards. We study the full history, the good and the bad, so we can do more of the good and so we can overcome the bad. And that's why we study this history. It's unpatriotic to just cheer. That's not patriotism. That's superficiality, and that's narcissism.
What do we do about some of the things in this book, some of the echoes in this book that linger today, in a practical sense?
I think first what we have to do is to try to understand why these echoes continue. Why is it that where I start the book, that these individuals from southern Delaware and others who ransacked the Capitol carried a Confederate flag and built a gallows? What's going on there? Why did they think they could lynch Mike Pence? Why did they use this 1870s rhetoric? Let's understand that, and then, like good doctors, let's go to the root. And at this very root has to be, in spite of all the positive changes in our society, many of which I think are serious, at the same time, there are still things supporting, encouraging white supremacy in our society. And let's start by electing leaders who are willing to take that on, who are willing to embrace inclusion for all, but also willing to address white supremacy in our society.
Democracies do not come together when they glorify their past, but when they strive to repair it.
That's how I close the book. It's a statement. It took me a long time to write that, but I really believe that. I think that's the patriotic mission. Our democracy is always improving, just like we hope our children are always improving, and we need to be part of that. The worst demagoguery is the demagoguery that says we've always been the best and we don't have to do anything different. That's the worst parenting and the worst leadership.
May I ask if you've decided on a next topic yet?
I haven't fully. I'm thinking of actually doing something, a similar kind of book, but a book that is focused on the period after the Cold War, what I'm calling fin de siècle America, the period from 1991 to maybe 9/11, and what happened in our society then that in some ways contributed to the challenges we have today.
Dr. Jeremi Suri, the author of Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Thanks so much for being here once again.
Evan, thank you. Great questions as always.
Thanks so much, Professor. Check out the book. Check out his website, jeremisuri.net. He's on Twitter at Jeremi Suri. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.